Welcome to All Grown Up Now, a tale of retail, relocation, revenge, reinvention, reckless behavior, really good clothes, indiscretion, infidelity, domestic violence, and one kidnapping. I'm Kenneth D. King, podcasting from my studio near Union Square in New York City. This is the beginning of a series of installments of a novel I wrote called All Grown Up Now, A Friendship in 3 Acts. The book tells the story of 2 main characters, Ken and Mark, and how Ken grows up in the framework of this friendship. This is the story of a small-town boy who dreams of being a grown-up. This is not a story that runs in chronological order. Instead, we'll go off on tangents that eventually relate back to the main narrative. Along the way, I'll introduce you to different people who influenced and entertained the main character, Ken. And if you haven't guessed already, that main character is me, and this is indeed autobiographical. But for this first installment, I feel compelled to give a little history and explain how we'll travel on this journey. First, the backstory. The novel started out in the late 1990s as a talking cure. I needed to sort things out in my head, and writing short stories to myself seemed the way to do it. After amassing a collection of these stories, a friend read over them and said that there was a connecting line and that I should look for that. It emerged that the connecting line was this friendship with the other character in the novel, Mark. Over time, I saw that through the framework of this friendship with Mark, I shook off my idea of what being a grown-up was and figured out what being all grown up now meant. That story is what I tell in the novel and what I'm going to be telling in this series of podcasts. My editor, Judy Newcomb, broke the book up into episodes, and we worked together to name each one. So I propose to start each installment with the name of the episode, give a little background as to time and place, connect back with the last episode if needed, and then launch into the story. At the end, if I feel some commentary is necessary, I'll add that. Then, I'll give the title of the next episode to give you something to look forward to. And that's how I propose to structure this podcast. For this first episode, I'd like to begin with one short installment and then one longer one. The short installment is what I call the Overture in the book. The longer one will be a little more of the back history from Act 1. So, here we go. The Overture. Time, April 1995. Place, San Francisco. I'd never kidnapped someone before. When I told Mark I didn't want to hear from him until he was ready to leave Victor, it didn't occur to me that, if he finally called after all those years, I would have to take such extraordinary measures to help out. As a sissy boy in Kansas, I got much of my information about life from watching movies. Sadly, though, all the movies I'd seen, not one gave me any real solid information about how to pull off this kind of caper, so I had to make it up as I went along. Mark's brother Robert called the day before to let me know there were guns involved, as Victor had a fondness for them, as well as other things like phone tapping equipment and surveillance cameras. Robert said that Mark was so traumatized he was scared to leave the house, but perhaps could be coaxed out for a short period of time. So I called Mark, using the fiction that I was going to be in Los Angeles on business, and we should have lunch. In my paranoia, I even made reservations at the Ivy, just in case Victor had tapped the phone and decided to call and check it out. What I neglected to tell Mark was that lunch would be in San Francisco, where I was living. I only bought him a one-way ticket, but I understood that this might not be a simple snatch and run. So, facing the very real possibility that things could go horribly wrong, I took steps. I made sure I rented the spiffiest convertible I could get, a black Chrysler LeBaron convertible to be exact. I also made sure I had on good underwear, as my mom used to say the ambulance wouldn't pick you up without it. They check first. And I made sure my hair was freshly bleached. My thinking was that if I got my brains blown out, I wouldn't have to pay for the spiffy car, and at least I would have gone out in style, good underwear, and with my roots done. As I drove to the airport, I thought about how I now found myself in this situation. This is something that, if things went horribly wrong, reporters might soon be asking about. As they say, long story, and that is the story of this podcast. Installment 2. The title is Dances with Landmines. The time is May 1980, and the place is Oklahoma City. Life began for me on May 6, 1980. I regard everything that went before as playing the out-of-town tryouts in New Haven before the opening on Broadway. That play would have been called Dances with Landmines. I graduated from Undistinguished University in Oklahoma on May 5, 1980, the first of the siblings to do so. I'm the middle boy child with two sisters, one younger, Kathy, and one older, Lori. My BS degree was in fashion merchandising with an emphasis on window display. I began sewing at an early age, 4 to be exact, for Barbie and my troll dolls. I had traded my gun and holster set to Kathy for Barbie. I had no interest in boys' toys. This caused both parents no end of concern as we were living in a small town in Kansas at the time. My Barbie wasn't a teenager like the official Mattel story. Mine was 27 years old, drove a convertible, owned only evening clothes, and went to the opera, the theater, and good restaurants. Since my parents would rather have severed a limb than buy Barbie clothes for me, I made all of her fab outfits. One favorite from that time was the strapless, full-skirted, gold damask number. The bodice was made from black grosgrain. She had a slim evening sheath that I knitted out of some gold metallic yarn that a neighbor was throwing out, and Barbie got her own mink coat and matching hat when another neighbor gave me an old fur collar. She inherited an entire set of rhinestone jewelry when Grandma cleaned out her jewelry box. I was always working on something. Deep down, though, I really wanted to be a fashion designer, but in Oklahoma City, which the locals sometimes refer to as OKC, display was the closest occupation I could imagine doing. The idea of being a fashion designer in OKC, well, I might as well have imagined living on Mars. But along with this deep desire to be a fashion designer was a real impatience to be a grown-up. Grown-ups had all the fun, like in the movies. They drove cool cars, dined at good restaurants, went to the theater, hung out with glamorous people. Life was a dream when you were a grown-up. It was this notion of being a grown-up that I projected onto Barbie. I joke now that instead of having an inner child, as most people claim to have, I grew up with an inner adult. Never mind that the examples of grown-ups around me didn't reflect this idea. They somehow didn't count. Grown-ups lived in big cities, had cool apartments, and led glamorous lives, and I resolved at a very early age that I, too, would be a grown-up. Now that I was graduating from college, I could step onto the path that would ultimately lead to this sparkling new life. Fast forward to the summer of 1986, San Francisco. During the summer of 1986, it was my 10-year high school class reunion. I debated whether or not to go, whether to spend the money on my new business, or just buy the ticket and go to OKC. Mark, during one of our many telephone conversations, which surprisingly was not about complaining about Victor, he actually seemed to hear what I was talking about, argued for going. Mark felt that going back to confront the demons that were from my adolescence would go far towards eliminating them. He apparently had missed his class reunions and regretted it, so I decided to go. The evening of the reunion was one of those rare days we've all had when it was a good hair day, plus a feel-thin day, plus a good complexion day, plus a good outfit day, all rolled into one fabulous burst of glory. It took about 3 months to get the right outfit for the reunion, but I looked fabulous. I wore a really smart dinner jacket, pleated trousers, and black and white Glen plaid with pinstripes of teal and sapphire blue, a white high-collar shirt with sapphire blue paisley silk tie, black cummerbund, and sapphire blue shoes. And, of course, the good hair. If I could choose to go back to one day in my life and look that way forever, this would have been the day. I arrived at the Holiday Inn, looking good and loaded for bear. Here I was, coming from San Francisco, an up-and-coming designer, and ready for the first person to set me off. Then came the exchange that launched me into my 10-year high school class reunion. The woman in question was Linda, one of the girls at the high school cafeteria table where I sat, who I met up with at the door. She started giving me the dish on all the people who didn't come to the reunion. During this monologue, she mentioned David Pierce, the other suspected homo in the class. Immediately, I was interested in what he was up to. "Oh, it's too horrible, I can't say," she gasped, her hand clutching her chest. "What's so horrible?" I asked. "Is he committing axe murders or something?" "Worse," she said. "What then?" "He married a man and moved to California." I looked her right in the eye, about 10 inches from her face, and said evenly, "What in the hell's wrong with that? That's just exactly what I did." Well, the color drained from her face onto the white polyester crepe georgette dress she was wearing, and she fled into the crowd. And it was as if the universe said, This is it, kid. Sing. Nothing in small town Salina, Kansas prepared me to experience school in Oklahoma City. In Kansas, I was an average student, in the orchestra where I could saw out a competent tune on the violin, a member of the student council, and was involved in the Christmas play. For those who are interested, I was little Jimmy Schimmelpfennig. Though I wasn't wildly popular, I wasn't a pariah either, but that changed when I got to OKC. We were enrolled at Western Oaks Junior High School. Everything in OKC seemed to be named fill-in-the-blanks Oaks. The first day was a bit frightening. The school was about 3 times larger than South Junior High in Salina, 3 floors compared to the single floor at South Junior High, and populated with lots of kids who all seemed to have a healthy fear of outsiders and could spot anyone who hadn't been there from the first grade on. Or perhaps it was animal instinct. They sensed that I came from another gene pool, and it made them nervous. My inimitable fashion sense, which had secured my reputation in Kansas as a clothes horse, was now a liability, one that definitely marked me as an outsider. Being a chubby, sissy boy and playing the violin didn't help much either. The second day of school was the first time I heard the word faggot. It was directed at me, and I extrapolated from context that faggot wasn't good. It seems that I was carrying my books like a girl, whatever that meant. Again, the clothes. I had embraced the body shirt, an unfortunate fad in the early 70s, whereby a man's shirt was cut with princess panels, those vertical seams usually seen on women's blouses. This supposedly gave a trimmer line, but sadly not on me. The one I was wearing on that particular day was a light mauve, worn with burgundy hip huggers and a wide white patent leather belt. From then on, it seemed, I had a tattoo of faggot invisible to me right on my forehead, and whenever any of the mouth-breathing boys in the school would walk past, knuckles dragging the ground, they'd utter it, usually just before spitting tobacco juice on me. It was the scarlet F that I was never able to see, let alone fully eradicate. In other words, I couldn't pass as straight. Not then, not now. A friend says that people can see it in the satellite photos from space. Daily spat upon and beat up, my clothes torn, my homework ruined, 4-letter words written on my back, school became a time of unrelenting misery for me. I know that sounds overdramatic, but it was the way I felt. We didn't have the word bullying back then. I also had the stigma of being somewhat smart, along with the violin playing, and a good student despite the harassment, which further branded me as no good. Add to the mix that in the 8th grade, I sewed and still played with Barbie. Now, mind you, I knew not to talk about it and did it in secret. I used to get grief from Mom, who would shriek about how I would turn into such a sissy, if I kept this up, but Barbie was an escape for me. As I said, my Barbie was 27 years old, lived in a big city, drove a convertible, only owned evening clothes, went to the opera and theater and good restaurants. In short, she was a grown-up. I learned sewing by making clothes for Barbie before I started sewing for myself as a teenager. Barbie taught me my love of fashion. Eventually, though, I carefully packed her up with all her clothes and hid her in the attic. I had a premonition that, if I didn't, one day I'd come home and she would be gone, because Mom would have thrown her away while I was at school. There was no time off for good behavior. Daily I ran the gauntlet at school, nightly I ran the gauntlet at home. Mom was married to her second husband, Don, who was a one-man chaos machine. More on that later. I'd be worried that, because of Don, Mom would be either dead when we got home, or if not dead, she would be so wrought up that I'd wish she were dead. A word on Don, her second husband. He was her second husband, not my stepfather. There's a difference for people who don't understand. Mom was just a wealth of comfort and understanding during this period. I told her some of my problems at school once, and her response was to shriek, "What are you doing to deserve it? If you weren't such a goddamn sissy, they'd leave you alone." Now that was a help. Why hadn't I thought of that? These conditions continued every year, all the way until I was a senior in high school. I managed to keep my grades up, saw away at the violin, and not get into any trouble. Nor did I do drugs or alcohol. Although my particular bad boy thing was to see how many cars I could drive before I was of legal age. The final number was 17. I decided that if I couldn't fit in anyhow, I was branded, you remember, I wouldn't even try. So no cigarettes because that's what they did. No drugs or booze, again because that's what they did. Also, I was, and am still, cheap about such things. Spending good money on something I couldn't wear, ride, look at, or tell time with didn't make sense to me. I've kept to the no smoking, no drugs, no alcohol thing ever since. It's not only because I'm cheap or goody two-shoes, but also because, as a teen, I saw that they caused too much trouble. As an adult, I choose not to have that kind of trouble in my life because adolescence was too painful for me. Consequently, because I was branded, I could wear anything I wanted to school. This was aided in my sophomore year when I started making my own clothes. My first project was a blue chambray shirt, and once I was hooked, my garments became more and more unusual. My finest fashion moment, and fuck you to the high school, was my outfit for Western Day. Imagine a sky blue satin Western shirt with sapphire blue rhinestones outlining the yoke, a sapphire blue cowboy hat, my Angel's Flight blue jeans, this was 1976, and very high platform shoes. It's a wonder I got home alive. Since I didn't fit in, though, it didn't matter. The mouth breathers were going to have comments about whatever I wore anyway. Strangely, though, the things I wore would filter into the wardrobes of the cool kids about a year later. Remember puka shell chokers? Feathered hair? Nylon disco shirts with the pictures printed on them? Fiorucci? I was given a hard time when I wore them, but within a year, all the jocks were wearing them, except, of course, for the Fiorucci. They couldn't even pronounce it, let alone spell it. I then had to move on to the next look, but I stuck with the platform shoes until college. Because I was, and still am, really short. Our installment for next time will be called Can I Drive Your Car?, where our hero engages in some small-time law-breaking. I'm Kenneth D. King, again podcasting from Union Square in New York City. I do hope you join me again and follow this podcast. I can also be followed on Instagram at Kenneth D. King. I am on Facebook at Kenneth D. King Design. And my website, where you can contact me, is All Grown Up Now. Thank you and have a good week.